when we look at the people in this room, your menus aren't that different. So that's going to be the first kind of bucket of information that we'll go through in this journey together. Then we're going to talk about how in this room itself, your colleagues, your friends, often the same, it's a diverse group of people that have very different priorities and different roles at different stages of the R&D process. A lot of it's going to be is applying what Daryl was talking about, but for the kitchen as opposed to the front of the house, candidly. And ingredients, components, and builds. And this is something that I've been working on over the past, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years. And I'm really looking forward to share it with you today and hear your opinions. And then we'll talk about the evaluation and about the evaluation process and how it's culturally contextual, which is very relevant to what we just heard about. So, a lot of chefs in the room. Carême and Escoffier. What did they do? Carême, anyone? Late 1700s, someone said it? Sauces, the mother sauces. Carême was the first chef to codify French cuisine's mother sauces. That's where it started. Now think about that. French cuisine isn't from the 1700s, right? It's been around for quite some time. But what he did is he actually codified, looked backwards and said, what are we really doing here? And this is, right, you have the bechamel, you add this, it turns into this. And then Escoffier came along and changed and paved the way for everything you all do in this room because he codified the kitchen brigade system. And without that, we didn't have restaurants. You had places to go eat, but you couldn't have scaled food without a system, right? It just wouldn't work. So today, what I'm doing in front of you is I want to take you on this journey of dissecting, deconstructing the menu into certain parts, but it's like these guys, not I'm like those guys. But my point is, I'm not telling you anything new today. Just like they didn't do anything new, they looked back, understood, curated, codified, and then shared that with the world, right? And then it's modified as the years have gone. So today, that's my approach, is more of showing you some things that you know in a different perspective and applying it to your business, okay? Ready for the journey? So, in this room, right, at the ICCA, it's pretty fascinating. We went through all your menus, like literally. And when you look at all of the menus of the people in this room or members of the organization as a whole, it's about 1,200 menu items when you start layering them up on top. Same thing we were talking about, taking it and drilling it down and drilling it down. Of those 1,200 menu items, when you really look at it, there's only 5 menu categories and about 30 different menu items. We're taking out, now I don't need to present this or defend it, except for you. So we've definitely whittled this down, right? So it's applied research. So we've been doing this research in an academic perspective, but actually applying it. And to me, it was fascinating to see that, like, oh, they're not that different. But every one of you in this room and every one of your team members have different objectives when you're evaluating flavor and when you're creating flavor. You look at it from a different perspective. How many times you've been in a cutting and someone says, well, I like black pepper and I don't care. It's not about you, it's about the consumer. However, it's not just about preferences, it's about application. It's about audits, it's about compliance, it's about food costs, marketing, branding. It's a complex equation, and everyone's got a different perspective. So I've actually changed my perspective a little bit over the past few years. As we develop more of the technology perspective and taking this academic research is realizing that everyone can have their own perspective and have a different role at different stages like you do. And so let me explain. Everyone in this room makes, buys, or sells one of these. Fair enough? Think about it. They're essentially the same thing. Now, an ingredient or component can be debatable at what stage, but I'm going to take you through very detailed each one of these. But what happens is as it moves down this process, from the sponsors with the ingredients or the components to the operators that are putting together into different builds, more value is created along that process. More energy is invested. More complexity is created. Right? Very different. And I'll go through these in detail. So, who's who's, I wouldn't say more important, who has authority? And how I look at it here is focus, priorities, involvement, and authority evolves. Now, it's the International Corporate Chefs Association. However, sorry, chefs, you're not the most important person at the beginning, and I don't think should be leading, frankly, in finding the ingredient. You have the authority to say, does that meet my specifications? Will this work in my operations? However, if you say to someone in purchasing, hey, we're working on this new salad, I need grape tomatoes, do you really need to say much more? There's a standard of identity to that. But depending on if you're making a salsa, well, that's a different story, isn't it? What tomato am I going to use? What color? What shape? How are we cutting it? Where does it come from? The consistency? There's so much to it. So I look at the first part. There's 3 buckets of information when I'm developing something. I look at the business equation, right? The compliance and culinary application. So I think at the beginning, it's more about the business equation. Then culinary, yes, the chef is controlled because now they're creating a complex flavor equation, combining all different ingredients together, and things start to change. Then, when it's a build, it's the same thing, but now you're kind of checking off. When you go from ingredients to components, a lot of the compliance issues, like where did it come from, do they have audits, traceability, all those things, are already baked into the system, so to speak. You found the right ingredients, but now when you put them together, how do they interact? What's the shelf life, and so on. And then the build, same thing. So, it's no different with sweet or savory. It's the same thing, whether it be cacao, right, chocolate and a cake, or actually the chocolate, the little pearls, and the cake. It's all almost like building blocks of flavor. And this is how we put these things together in our menus. And so, if I was tasting chocolate or tasting a dessert for chocolate, this might be some of the things that our group of people might say. Makes sense, right? Everyone's got a different point of view. No one's more important. It's an interactive experience, and flavor is a subjective experience. There is no best. Right? I mean, it's a perspective. It's an opinion. And the customer, right, knows what's best, but every customer is different. So just some examples, a little fun with the name. So I've spoken to this group several times, and you've seen this kind of diagram that I created 20 years ago, this data model. I never realized, now that I'm going into academia again, it's like, oh, that was a data model. I never thought about that. So then I started working with the folks up at UC Davis and actually taking it and saying, oh, I didn't realize that the internet wouldn't work for searching for recipes if there weren't consistencies. BBC, Google, several schema.org, they've actually codified what a recipe is step by step. So we've went through, because otherwise you can't talk among different languages. Think about that for a second. Realize when you're searching on Google, it can happen in a lot of languages. So if we don't have common vocabulary and meanings and context, it's going to be inaccurate. It doesn't work. So, if you want, I didn't share the academic side. This is, again, really intense, going through it. But if you're interested in looking at how to digitize recipes, break them down, just shoot me an email or reach out to me later. I'll be glad to give it to you. So, it's Robert Danhi. So I know you expect something about Asia, right? That's not what the subject's going to be in general, but let me give you a little taste of the standard thing. So I've been doing a lot of research on fermented bean products. All over the world, but primarily in China, and as that's moved around, up in Korea, Japan, etc. And all different bean paste made from soybeans, all of them, right? They look kind of different though, don't they? Different uses, different flavors, different applications, different cultures, processes, nutritional value, all different, but it's, RJ, we were talking about this yesterday. I am taking a carbohydrate and I'm adding koji to it. Ta-da, I have miso. After some time and watching, okay, so ingredient, component, and build. Let's start applying this. Let's see how this really works, right? So if you look at an ingredient, what the ingredient might be. Might be fermented soybeans. Well, if you take fermented soybeans and then you start adding chilies to it that are fermented and aging it for a couple years, there's something called Pijian Tobanjian. Now, this is a fermented chili bean paste, and if you look at China, then you come down to Sichuan, the province. Then you come down to the region of Chengdu. Then you come down to this little area called Pijian. Pigeon is known for this sauce. And so importantly, just like with the wines, what is it, DOC? Yeah. So those, you can only put Pigeon, Tobanjan, if it's from this region. It's been fermented for 2 years. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So what? Well, if I'm doing product development, because there's a lot of global brands, right, with the ICCA. So what I'm talking about today is the International Corporate Chefs Association. We're going to base it in an American case study after this. However, it's a global organization, so how do you translate? How do you communicate? How do you keep eyes on what's happening around the globe with your brands, with what you've worked so hard for? How do you communicate to another culture with for the sponsors, right? If you look at it, what is an ingredient flavor profile, how it's applied is very contextual, besides the person, the family, the culture, and there are some generalities that have been studied very well. So Pigeon Doban, what I found out, had no idea. Check out this video.
这个实际上它发酵的时间就要短一些，这个对这个发酵的时间就要长一些，这个颜色要深一点，它的酱香味就要越浓一些。但因为不同的川菜，它适合用不同的郫县豆瓣来做菜，包括我们的麻婆豆腐，包括我们的宫保鸡丁，其实，不是宫保鸡丁，麻婆豆腐、回锅肉，麻婆豆腐一般要用4年的郫县豆瓣，而我们的回锅肉要用3年的郫县豆瓣来做。
Okay, so let me translate a little bit of that, right? Not in the dialect, I don't speak Mandarin. So we had a lot of people doing research around the world with us, and this was one place that we found these folks, and what was to me fascinating about this is dependent on the age, which impacts the color, indicates which dish it's used for traditionally in that region. It's like, that's interesting. So what dish would be an example? Mapo tofu. Right? That is a Chengdu dish that has Tobanjan in it, but it had to be this color and had to have that size, and otherwise it wouldn't have been authentic, if I dare use the word. So learning this and understanding it, it's no different than a tomato and how you use it in a pico de gallo, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So there's so many different restaurants here. We had to do a case study. So John Carlos Ensaladas, right? Not quite a real chain, but a real concept. So if you think about the folks that are running John Carlos Ensaladas, or some of the team, each one struggles when they're doing tastings and evaluations, because one person says this and that person says that, and familiar comments, maybe some things you may have even said before, right? It's a challenge to communicate because everyone's got a different role and a different authority, and who does when, what, why. So with this, let's look at salsa, right? First we look at tomato, that's the ingredient, which gets transformed into a pico de gallo or a salsa of some sort, then goes into let's say it's a Tex-Mex Cobb salad, right? John Carlos Ensaladas, after all. And you look at, as it goes through, how the first step, I'm looking at product specs, right? Okay, check off the box, sensory attributes, yes, it does that. Where can I get it? What's the packaging? I mean, these are real business issues. These are real compliance things that you have to check off the boxes. Okay, so we got the right tomato, which we'll get into in a second. Then you move into, and now you're making a salsa. Oh no. Well, now you're thinking, do I need a HACCP plan? Do I have this? Where's it coming from? How long do we use this cilantro? There's the interactions of the food. There's the complexity of someone making it. There's a lot more that goes into it. And then we get into the builds. Well, now, what's the customer going to think of it when they buy it? Does it meet their expectations? How are we trained? What's the training? What's the equipment? So you can see, as it goes through this process, it just gets more complicated, and everyone here is who makes it successful. Everyone, the sponsors, the members, the media, contributes to this body of knowledge that you all pull from. And so, let's get into the ingredients. We'll take this one by one. So first, fruits are not vegetables. Now take a look at this chart for a moment. So what? Why does this matter? Someone challenged me. From a product development process, who cares? Look carefully. Fruit. What is a fruit after all? What defines a fruit? Seeds, inside or outside? Depends, right? But it's a fruit. Has to have seeds, otherwise it ain't a fruit. So what? If I'm doing menu development, why does this matter? Okay, avocado. Do you take the seed out of an avocado before you use it in your operations? Always. Right? You don't serve. I've never served an avocado seed that I'm aware of. So that you know what you're buying. So now you're considering, how big is the seed? What's my yield on it? Wait, should we actually get it pre-prepared? So you see what it is, how it's physically, the form, the function, completely changes your decision process from purchasing to implementation to training. How are they going to take that seed out? Do we need a tool? All of those things. So when you move it down, you go to mango, same thing, seed comes out. Melon, well, cantaloupe, you always take it out, but with watermelon, do you take out the seeds? But what about seedless watermelons? You would specify that, and so the chef would just say, I need this seedless, and it needs to be ripe and red, and this, right? So as you go down, that's part of the decision. Now, when you get to a cucumber, that's a whole different story, isn't it? Because the type of cucumber may indicate if you take out the seeds, sometimes if it's whole or cut or scraped, or you're chefs, right? You're just food people, you get it. And then as you move down to cucumbers, the example today is it a round, a Roma, or a grape? Okay, survey. Hands up if you use Roma tomatoes to make a raw salsa. Up, come on, really? Okay. And how many people, 12, how many people would use like a 5x6, a round tomato? Okay, more people. How many people would use a grape tomato? Okay, you've got too much labor. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, are you going to take the seeds out? Why would you use more people said round. Why? Let's talk a little bit. Think about it. One, because you got it into, you're putting it in the component, so I got this ingredient, I got to use a few places. So it's used in other things. But if you didn't have to worry about that, if you were making pico de gallo this weekend for your friends, would you use a Roma or would you use a round? Why? Well, if you want a wet salsa. If I want a dry salsa for chips, I am not using a 5x6, I'm using a Roma. But if I'm putting it on top of a salad and it's one of the functional ingredients that adds flavor to it, or maybe it is the dressing. Right? So it's a very deliberate process that, again, I'm not telling you anything new, but you do this just instinctively because you've grown up, worked at it, but don't assume that other people on your team understand how you think. So codifying this and speaking the same language. So a little bit more detail. So what about with the ingredient? If I'm looking for a tomato, what am I looking at? Supplier relationships, costing parameters, availability, right? What else in the business equation? Let's have some people talk a little bit here. What are some other things you consider? Just blurt them out. Seasonality. What else? Consistency, okay? Availability. That's not up here? What else? What am I missing? Cross-utilization. Thank you, Chef. Yeah. Yes, ripeness. Thank you. So there's all sorts of things. Compliance, you can see it, you can read. So it's pretty straightforward. Looks like, right from the chef's side, hey, it's got to look like this, it's got to have this flavor, and it's got to function. Okay, the rest is up to you. Not my job. So then, how do you take a survey and ask people this in an efficient way? I don't care if it's on paper, I don't care if it's digital, I don't care if it's a conversation. What are the questions you ask to assess, is this the right tomato, in a methodical way? And here, moisture content, size, shape, everything, how do you cut it? Are we cutting it or are we cutting it? Big difference, right? Completely changes the decision-making process in developing this recipe. So what about the components? Well, the components now, it's starting to get a little bit more complicated because you're building in all these different parts. Well, we've got 3 types of fruit, actually. Well, one of them I'm going to leave the seeds in and I'm going to do a small dice. The next one I'm going to take out the seeds because it's too spicy. Limes. Okay, so just Of all the people, how many people have some type of lime in their restaurant? Okay. How many people buy whole, fresh limes? Okay. And how many people buy lime juice? A lot of the same people. Okay, so if I'm putting lime juice inside a salsa, I have to make a choice, don't I? Do I take a fresh lime? Do I buy the juice? Is it, I mean, all the time. Why would you, so for those of you who have made salsa in large-scale operations, tell us something. What did you use and why? Come on, you guys are not this shy. What's that? Just, it's pretty and is it that important of a ingredient? But do you ever, would you, if someone was making it for you, right? Okay, you're making it in-house, would you maybe put some lime oil? Somebody last night, I think somebody at our table for dinner was saying, well, I always use lemon and lemon zest, never just juice. Keith, that was you, right? We were talking about that yesterday. I don't always do that, but I understand why. And yesterday, remember the demo, how we squeezed the juice over the lemon to get more flavor out of it? So if you were going to use whole limes, let's say that was one of your brand attributes, right? It's salsa is what you do table side. You need to squeeze that lime. Or you're even doing back of the house. What do you need to consider with the limes themselves in actually using them? How many people would wash the limes as part of that process before they're juiced? You would hope they are. How many people would think their cooks would always wash the limes before they use them? Because they didn't fall on the walk-in and roll over and then pick them up and put it back in the box that they... In this room, what, 90% of people have seen that happen or have done it? Well, they're going to wash it. So that's a really critical thing in the menu development process. It's just lime juice. What was the decision tree? What was the thing that we thought through? And down the line. So you get my point. So with the components, now what? All the things we did with ingredients and, right? This is a plus up at this stage. So with plus up, it's the total flavor profile. It's the functionality. For this, it's pretty simple. It's not that functional. Although, is it going to be the dressing, or is it going to be on top, or is it going to be for 3 different menu items? Now, if we're talking about a spread for a burger, perhaps, and it's for to-go, you might be thinking of the functionality of protecting the bread from the moisture, which may indicate the type of fat you use or how thick it is, and all these things that you just do. But if you deconstruct it, you can talk about it much more efficiently. So costing, and so the HACCP plan, that was because if you were making, and I don't know this in all sincerity, if you're making fresh salsa in one of your restaurants, do you need a HACCP plan for that because of that wash step or anything, or it's just salsa? Depends by the state, thank you. Okay, so some states, yes. Makes sense, doesn't it? Seems, it's like, oh, it's salsa, right? Okay. So then, what do we look here? Well, here, it's an interesting one. Temperature. Why is temperature important when you're tasting a salsa? How many times has someone sent you samples, come in and done it, a chef done a cutting, and they set them all up in 2-ounce cups, and they're sitting at room temperature, and then they come out, we were tasting them. Are they served the temperature in which it's served? And it changes everything. And that's why I'm being so pedantic. It's so specific about these little details, because good food, great food, is a culmination of every little decision along the process, from where you got it from to what you did with it, right? All the way through it. So temperature, I think, is really important. Thickness, moisture is what you brought up. So let's look at the build. Uh-oh. Well, now it's getting a little bit more complicated, isn't it? And this isn't that complex of a salad. And you've got fruits, you got proteins, you got vegetables. How did I process it? Where did I get it from? What was, I mean, there's so much. And this should make you feel good about what you do and think of like, wow, it's a complex equation flavor. And it really is an equation. Recipes are essentially an algorithm. Think about it. Decisions, does this, then does that, then does that. It works like that. So with a build, well, now you've got the total flavor experience, and now really what comes in is brand fit, customer value proposition. Is this what it is? What type of marketing plan? Don't you know if you're creating it, part of the presentation may be based on the style of the restaurant, the brand, I mean, there's so much to be considered among all of this. Okay, and same thing with this. It's about ratios, isn't it? When you start building things, it's how much of this to how much of that, and then you say, well, we costed it. Oh, the sauce is costing us 83 cents, and we got to pull that down to 75. Chef, what can we do from a flavor perspective, right? It's this interaction of, it's these different levers that we go up and down, and adjust them till everything's just, right? The base is just right across. So what about implementing this? So that's kind of the theory. So how do you talk about this efficiently? Because I find, and I don't know if you agree, that so much of our time is just sucked up and wasted by inefficient communication because it's such a complex equation. And we make us, oh yeah, they'll know what to do with it. I was talking to some people last night about samples. Oh yeah, it's like, no, there's a lot to it. So, believe it or not, discovered this, this was just published 2 years ago. There's actually global standards for small group tastings and cuttings. Fascinating papers, worth downloading and reading them. It really helps you think through what you do, how you coordinate it, it's fascinating, really, really good work. So another time I can send that to you. But words plus definitions equal lexicons. You said earlier verbiage, which I think was a great way of building onto that. Like what verbiage do you use indicates what people expect. What they think, what they feel, their emotions, everything comes from the way we communicate. However, context is everything. And culture, at a table, a little table like this, there's this little subculture, right? And then, and Daryl, you're your own culture right there, right? And so we each have our own different fear that we're different. So I came across this word, never heard it, like 3 or 4 years ago, for how much a geek I am. I can't believe I never heard this. And I was up at UC Davis, and they're like, oh yeah, that's an ontology. What you're doing, you're building ontologies. I'm like, well, what's an ontology? And then I realized, oh, it's not just the words and the definitions, but it's the relationships, and that's how you can codify a recipe, deconstruct it, communicate more efficiently. Because if you're all on the same page of the context, well, then it makes sense. So why would you take the time, invest the money, to develop an ontology for your internal team? I thought what was fascinating about Daryl was talking was an outward, which was perfect. I'm looking inward, and how do you talk to each other? How do you communicate more efficiently? And if you think about having structure, having consistency, speaking the same language. Last night at dinner, it was just wonderful. And then after having a drink, and I was like, it's just so nice. I have friends, I have an amazing wife, I have a lot of good friends, fantastic family, but coming to the ICCA, it's not just friends, but they're friends that get you. And why is that? Why are the people here some of the best friends of your life? It's the times you spent, but it's because you speak the same language, in the same context. You get it. It's the same thing of breeding that culture within your team, and so you can communicate better. So this is another way of looking at flavor is, it's the 5 senses. That's nothing new. But I thought this was a brilliant way that Trini and Matthew Lang built, and they did this up at UC Davis of like, well, that was a good way of looking at how they organized it, right? It was succinct. It's like, oh, that makes sense. Eating, sound, crunch. These are decisions that we consider when we build, construct flavor, and when we deconstruct it and evaluate it. So how do you do this, right? I mean, Daryl, you told him you took an SPSS, never knew that software. Oh, it's for doing qualitative analysis. Oh, I've been for the last 8 years trying to understand that. And so what I do is kind of a hybrid. Semi-academic, definitely. As a consultant, I have to apply. Who questions me is when I'm, well, I've worked with a lot of you. I have to apply this knowledge. That's who I have to defend it to. And so how do you do this in a practical sense? So this is how I do it, and how you can too. First, getting a frame of reference, crowdsourcing that. You can use Google Sheets, you can ask people, you can do surveys, there's a bunch of ways to go through it. But you're gathering this content. You talked about respondents. Well, I asked for 150, I got that, that was enough. So what is the right level of respondents? It depends on the situation. You look at previous literature. When I was looking at really diving into this, and then I realized for cheese, right? Chef Wallace and I were talking about it, and we were going to work on this together and do like cheese, and then I realized there's already an entire ontology for cheese evaluation. Established. Take that, whittle it down, and make it applicable, because you got to be able to use it. Otherwise, it's just making it more complicated. That's not the point. This is go wide, just like the innovation process. You go wide, you go out, you're here, you're learning, you distill that information, you come up with some solid ideas, right? You come up with those gold standards, then you come back out, you go wide with versions, you come back in, you nail it down. It's the academic model, out, wide, and today, obviously, with our talks, it's wide. Hey, this is what it is. Then how do you, you're all professionals. You're the top of the business. You're most accomplished food people in this business. So you're going to figure this out individually, but because it's going to be different for each one of you, because you all have a different culture. Then you generate those terms. What's the definitions? What's the references? Culture. Oh, that's nutty like this. Well, what type of nut? Right? Using references are very culturally relevant. And then you merge those together, and all the time you're putting cultural context, you're looking at professional background, you're putting sensory science into it. It's this hybrid of academic research and real product R&D. Okay, this was a realization that came up in this bean study that was like, oh. I found out, because I, as you know, like recording videos, as you see during all these sessions, et cetera. Photos are worth, what, 1,000 words, they say? Videos are worth millions. And when I found out, the same question that we asked, 75 people in this case, the same question that was in writing, right? And they typed it in. And then when we just say, hey, just record a video and tell us what you, and they recorded a video casually, oh my goodness, the difference of what people said. And so what, right? Well, let's say thickness. Boswick, texturometer, whatever. We have tools to measure these things, but I'm a cook. I'm in the kitchen, I'm doing product development, I'm making a sample that I need to send to somebody to replicate. Could you in the lab? Sure, use a Boswick, of course you could. But also a 5-second video clip kind of shows it. And what was really interesting with this study, here, check this out. It's just fascinating. So, in your own mind, sauce or paste, A, B, C, each one. Mental note. Okay, now what? Sauce or paste? A, obviously. C, obviously. B? It depends. Last night, I think, RJ, you said this, that you use it as a thickener, right? Ingredients are functional. They're not just flavorful. And so if you're sending a sample to someone, and this, I want it to look like this, it feels like this, just that. Now, so what about paste or sauce? And this was so interesting about this. Go back to there for a second. Fermented bean pastes are salty. There's a high level of sodium. Why? Right? I mean, it's a primary preservative, right? Especially if it's non-refrigerated. So you can't get you need that for microbial growth and all those other things. So what we found was when people were tasting these, and they said they were, if it was labeled a sauce, they had completely different expectations than labeled a paste, similar to your menu example. And really, what impacted, the viscosity wasn't as much an issue because the consumer, you generally don't put paste on a menu, do you? But we talk about paste and sauces. If it was a sauce on the label, oh, it's too salty. If it was a paste, nope. Why? As menu developers, why? What does that mean? Please.
Paste, I
It's an ingredient, not a component. Essentially, right? You're using it as an ingredient. Now you see, right, we circle back to the beginning. A component is something that's ready to use in general. There's exceptions to everything. Does that make sense? So how you market it, your own products to the sponsors, and the people that are buying it, how you communicate. That's why I thought this was really relevant for this conversation, for this group, is how do you talk to each other more efficiently? Right? With internally as a team, and then as you go out. Okay, so how do you do this efficiently? Now, how many people have used Zoom this year? There are all sorts of technologies that you can use. Zoom is fantastic. Do you realize you can transcribe your entire Zoom calls, right? And there's software that you can go through. So if you're having a call and you record that, and then you record these calls from these tastings, and you line up those words, and you whittle it down, you'll learn what your vocabulary is. You'll know what you talk. And then you can search through it, and you can bring it together, and what are we talking about, and what are we doing? And then you can start searching through it and start building your lexicon to use within your group. So applying those cultural filters, really important. Skippy. So if someone says nutty, or even roasted peanut, I think in this group, have we ever done the whole peanut thing, raw, deep fried, roasted with the group and on any of our work? So every time I teach a cuisine on Thai food generally, or some type of class on Thai food, I take a raw peanut, some raw peanuts, more than one, oven roasted, right? Deep fried, and pan roasted. Do they taste different? It's just the peanut. It's that application of heat and the type of heat at the length in which you do it. And culturally, if you make a Vietnamese peanut sauce, you're doing it with the deep fried peanuts, that is a rarity. It's generally pan roasted. You're making a peanut sauce in Malaysia, different story, deep fried. A majority of the time. So these things are culturally relevant. And so you may just use peanut butter in the sauce, but if you're launching your brand in Vietnam, you want to have your supplier yourself roast those peanuts, chop them up, and sprinkle them on top to indicate it's like theirs, dependent on the brand and everything else. Does that make sense? So, flavor wheels are awesome tools. This one I saw, actually, it's a picture just from the coffee shop by my house. And I thought it was just badass for a few reasons. Really cool. One is you don't see many wheels that come out further, for coffee obviously, that show intensity. But what I found really interesting is the whole thing about the adjectives and the intensifiers and what's bad. How many times do you say, hey, all this is great, but we just don't want it to be bitter, we don't want it to be like this, the not wants are as important as the wants. And so having something like this, when you're talking with folks that don't have the depth of experience you do, or the customers, giving them something to latch onto. Oh yeah, I like that. I mean, you've been in a wine tasting, Barnyard. Oh yeah. Before that, you had no idea. So for those bean pastes, the way that I've been working on constructing these wheels is first, in the middle, is your senses. Because everyone has those 5 senses, right? Touch for this isn't really relevant, because it's just not that type of product. So you don't need that sense that much, or the sound, excuse me. But I start off with the visual and the yellow, because that's the first thing. And in general, the wheels that we've been constructing go from, what you see, right, to what you take, moving around, what you smell, in the order in which we would consume it. Makes sense. But if you start it from sense, and then you have attributes, then you have descriptors, pause. When you get to the outer ring, that's when references, culture is everything. Because it's a relevant thing to it. So it might be like lactic if it's a scientific group, but you may use something else for another group. And so for this, we found that people didn't like, when they said, oh, it's this, these were the bad flavors. But then also, I at first was calling them complex flavors. And then I stopped myself and said, actually, they're flavor complexes. And what I mean by that is, how many times have you said, oh, it tastes like, oh, it's like that, tastes like, and it's a way you can communicate like that. Oh, it's like Manhattan clam, no, I wouldn't say that word. It's like New England clam chowder. Well, what does New England clam chowder have to have in it? It's just not New England clam chowder. There's a lot of negotiables. Got to have pork of some sort, right? Probably salt pork. What else? Clams. Oh, that is brilliant. Clams, that's insightful. Dairy? What dairy? I'm not from here. I'm not an expert. Light cream? Heavy cream? Potatoes. Well done, RJ. Well played. Potatoes. I mean, there's celery. Would you agree, everyone? Celery? I think so. Onion, thyme, rosemary? No, right? Just checking. But you see, my point is, if you say that to someone, there's a standardized identity, you save time. You can say it, they get it. Done. So, moving forward, what this leads us to is ways to quantify this qualitative experience. You can have reference points, and just like you were saying, Daryl, then you can have hedonic scales, you can have jar scales, whether it be for application, there's all different. Well, does it? And you go through it. Make sense? Now, what's so freaking cool about technology is it breaks down so many cultural barriers. Because you start looking at it, how many times in manufacturing, food manufacturing, production is probably a more appropriate term, how many of you have seen color chips used to match color samples of sauces or something? Raise your hand. Oh, wow. Okay, so that's about 20 of you. Please participate in this. Second thing is, for those that have done that, were they like Pantone colors like that? Or were they actual pictures of the food? So if they were Pantone colors, raise your hand, or some type of color chip. How many people had actual food? Which do you think would be more accurate? Hello, it's just a frickin' photo. Like, why not build interactive tools for your team? Right? It looks like this once it's cooked. And you do this, right? Speed sheets, you do a lot of these things already, but from the development process, not just in the implementation process. What's shiny look like? What is a whole bean? What's chunky, really? But then you get into, well, what's tacky or gooey? Well, when you're holding the container down so it doesn't lift up with the sauce, that's gooey. And seeing that, it's obvious what it is. But sometimes, to illustrate the point about the cultural context, if you just say roasted soy flour, what does that mean? Well, this is a certain soy flour from Japan that's used for mochi and things like that. You dip it and sprinkle it on top like a roasted nut would be used. But no one else would know that unless you knew that. And so if you're in that region, that might make sense. And then another thing about technology is, this thing called Google Translate or whatever other software, that Zoom call, you can translate into different languages, right? Or the casual conversation you can translate and easily communicate. Now, I warn you, one thing I've learned in working globally and communicating with an international audience is that is step one. You don't want to just use that, especially in business application, because oh my goodness, the mistranslation. But it's a good first step. Then it needs to be put in context. So to me, there's a difference. In this case, you don't need a translator. You need an interpreter that interprets the translation. Does that make sense? So many times when I was filming Taste of Vietnam, I'm like, no, don't interpret. Translate what I'm telling you. Just stop. Simon's like, yeah, I know. You say it's okay. First, ask him this question. Because if you tell your translator what you want to know, they're going to get straight to the question and you're screwed. Because then you've just lost that. You want to first, hey, how about this? You ask them something. You build the rapport. You ask the question. You get to where you're going, but you can't jump there immediately. So I needed, at that point, because I knew how to talk with the culture, but in other places, in Japan that I'm not as familiar with, that I need an interpreter. Big difference. Huge difference. So that's it. Just wanted to give you a taste of, from the beginning, of what it is, where do you go, how do you roll it down, and what we're doing is codifying, going backwards, not creating, codifying menu items. And if I'm making a burger, right, it's going to have a bun. Well, what type of bun? Well, if it's a pretzel bun, I'm evaluating what? The salt on top, the color, the crumb. Well, if I use this type of bun, we know what it is. When we started laying out, we've codified like the entire menu, and you start going, oh, It's actually not that different. Then you build templates for your organization in your library, so when you're doing a tasting, it's not this arduous task. Take the time ahead, build your system, and then implement it. Change the, except for now, you go out, you capture all this information, or you don't, and then you're trying to figure it out. You know what you're asking, you know what you want to know, you know your objectives. Ask the right questions, going back to academia, and you'll get good answers. But put it in a structured format. Just a haphazard, non-democratic, poorly documented discussion, it's just irresponsible. There's times it's fine, hey, what do you think? That's different. But when you're making a business decision, oof, it just scares me to see what we've all seen of these decisions being made.